If you look back at the features in modern racing games, you'll find that a lot of them can trace their roots back to Gran Turismo 1 and 2 on the original PlayStation. Gran Turismo was the game that started it all. Well, not racing games in general, but how a lot of racing games are today. For those who have been living under a rock for the past 23 years or so, Gran Turismo is a racing semi-sim that was developed by Polly's Entertainment, which would then later become Polyphony Digital. But what a lot of people don't know is that another game developer known as Cyberhead helped develop the game as well. Not sure why Polyphony Digital agreed to let Cyberhead in on the development, as they hadn't made a game on the scale of Gran Turismo before. But I guess that goes for a lot of developers, as Gran Turismo was one of the biggest games ever when it was released. They actually didn't even have a racing game of any kind on their not so long list of games that they had developed, so it probably would have been better to have Namco help Polyphony Digital with the development as they did Ridge Racer. Gran Turismo's development wasn't easy. The director of Polyphony Digital, Kazunori Yamauchi, said that work started on the semi-sim in the second half of 1992, and overall the game took 5 years to develop. Kazunori said that he couldn't see the end of development as they had a lot of technical difficulties with the PlayStation. That is something that would become a reoccurring theme in the development of Polyphony Digital's games. Gran Turismo ended up using 75% of the PlayStation's hardware, and a lot of the game was scaled back because of that, such as the amount of cars in one race. The original plan was to have up to 12 cars on the track at once, which is something that wasn't possible until Gran Turismo 5 Prologue, released 10 years after the first game, on a console that was 2 generations newer and 100 times more powerful than the first PlayStation. It's amazing that only 7 to 15 people worked on the game, especially when you compare it to the amount of people who work on the modern Gran Turismos, which I think is about 140. Gran Turismo was released on the original PlayStation in December 1997 in Japan, and May 1998 in Europe and North America. You start the game with 10,000 credits, which isn't a lot and isn't enough for a new car, so the best that I could do was a used Toyota Supra Mark III with about 230 brake horsepower. I didn't have enough money after buying the car, so I couldn't buy any upgrades. But that 230 brake horsepower is enough to get started, as the Sunday Cup isn't that hard. The game gives you a lot of money for winning the Sunday Cup, and you get a Mazda Demio as a prize car, which can be sold for 12,000 credits at a Mazda dealer, or can be used in the FF Cup. But I wanted the money, and then I did the Sunday Cup again, so I could also have the Demio. Now, that bit about selling the Demio at a Mazda dealer is important, as you get more money if you sell the car at the dealer that it would have come from. They stopped doing it that way after this game, which might have been for the best, as the game gives you 12,000 credits for every car. I get that the developers intended you to keep your cars, use them in races and build up your collection, but 12,000 credits is nothing compared to how much some of those cars should be worth. Before you're allowed to do any races that gives you more than 1,000 credits for winning, you will need to get the licenses. Overall, there are 3 licenses that you'll need to do to be able to complete the whole game. The license tests have you doing the basics of driving, such as braking and accelerating, driving round corners, and doing time trials. This might sound easy, but you have a very small amount of time to complete these tests. You shouldn't have trouble with the B license at all if you've been playing racing games for a few years, but the other 2 do take more skill and quite a few attempts. You get either gold, silver or bronze depending on how quickly you do the tests. And I'm going to be honest here, I didn't get gold at all, which shows how hard the tests are compared to the later games in the series. I can't think of a game that had been released by 1997 which had you doing tests in order to do races, and even to this day, just over 23.5 years later, There still aren't that many games which are like that, as the only two that come to mind straight away are Test Drive Unlimited 2 and Sega GT 2002. There could be a good reason for that. You shouldn't be forced to do a really hard test or tutorial in order to complete a lot of the game. That is something that Reflections learnt very quickly when they released the first driver in 1999, as a lot of people couldn't get past the tutorial right at the beginning of the game. But that is a story for another video. Once you've bought a car and you've got a license of some kind, then you can actually start getting somewhere in the game. The only way to get into the game and also having a chance of doing well is by doing the events in the GT League. I see the GT League as a way to build up your car collection and get a bit of money to upgrade the cars that you have. That will make the rest of the game easier. There are 4 championships in the GT League for you to complete. There's the Sunday Cup, the Clubman Cup, the GT Cup, and the GT World Cup. Each one is harder than the last, so it's best to buy a cheap sports car and keep upgrading it after every championship, but not too much as the game will start to get boring. If you want more of a challenge, then you can do the special events. The special events have all of the driveline races, such as the FF Cup and the All-Wheel Drive Cup, but it also has the Tuner Cup and the Mega Speed Cup as well. These events are a lot harder than the ones in the GT League, but you do get more money which can be used to buy more cars and upgrades for those cars. You will need to upgrade your car for these events. Even with my 900 horsepower Skyline GTR, the best that I could get in the Mega Speed Cup was 3rd overall, and that was with me tuning it for every track. Even though the game is quite long for an original PlayStation game, it did need more events, as I had completed most of the game, excluding the endurance events, in about 8 hours, which isn't long enough for a game with a wide variety of cars. I want a reason to buy some of the cheap low-powered cars in the game. That issue was fixed in Gran Turismo 2 with the manufacturer events. The game doesn't have as many race restrictions that the later games have, so you only really have to think about what country the car is from and the driveline. This means that you can use the same car for multiple events. You can do that in the later games, but not to the same extent as the original Gran Turismo. Even as early as Gran Turismo 2, 2 years later, you have to start thinking about how much power the car has, the upgrades that you've installed, and the type of car you have. This being the first game in a series by a developer who hadn't done anything like this, on a console that wasn't very powerful, you'd think that the physics aren't that good. And you'd be right. Gran Turismo's physics engine was built off Motor2 Grand Prix physics engine. The two games are very different. One is a racing semi-sim and the other one is an arcadey Mario Kart ripoff, and I think a lot of the issues with the physics was because of that. The AI also aren't that good. They know how to drive, but they don't know where you are on the track, so they do bump into you if you're driving slowly. They also bump into you if you cut across the driving line whilst being very close to them. The AI were coded just to follow the racing line. You can see this by how weird their driving is at the beginning of a race. Let's use the high speed ring as an example. The racing line is on the right side of the track, and all of the AI cars on the left side of the grid go straight to the right side as soon as they can. Imagine how much worse the races would be if the developers managed to get all 12 cars on the track at once, instead of just 6. Gran Turismo doesn't feature a single real-world track, but Polyphony Digital did a brilliant job making tracks from scratch. Some of the tracks are different depending on what game mode you are on, such as Trial Mountain, which has a slight jump added on the straight, which was probably added to make the arcade mode a little bit more exciting. Fun fact, the arcade mode was added last minute as the developers thought Western players wouldn't find Gran Turismo mode fun or interesting. They were very wrong. There are only 11 tracks, which isn't a lot, but it wasn't the case of just taking photos of a track and then building it up into 3D. They had to design everything. There might not be that many tracks, but there are a lot of cars. There are 140 cars in Gran Turismo, ranging from hatchbacks such as the Honda Civic and the Nissan Pulsar to supercars and GT cars like the Honda NSX and the Aston Martin DB7. Most of the cars are Japanese, because the game was originally made with Japan in mind, and Japanese people like Japanese cars. So you have a lot of cars from Honda, Toyota, Mazda, Mitsubishi and Nissan, and just a few cars from TVR, Aston Martin, Dodge and Chevrolet. Even though there are somewhat 140 cars, I would only drive a few of them because I don't really see the point of having more than one version of a car in the game. And that is something that has been an issue with most of the games in the series. It would have been better to have different models in the game than the same models with different engines and trim. That is something that Polyphony Digital has only just stopped doing for Gran Turismo Sport, and will hopefully continue not doing for Gran Turismo 7. There's also no need to drive any of the low-powered cars in the later parts of the game, as they aren't needed at all. The cars were made very well and look realistic for a PlayStation game from 1997. This is amazing considering the cars were put into the game using models which may have one or two things out of proportion instead of using real cars. The game looked so realistic that for the first time ever, a video game could be considered as advertisement. TVR's sales went up by 400% after appearing in Gran Turismo. This is probably why more of their cars appeared in Gran Turismo 2, even though the two games are only 2 years apart from one another and TVR hadn't released a new model in that time. One of the things that sets Gran Turismo apart from most racing games that had been released up until that point was the fact that it gave you the ability to tune and upgrade your car. You can do almost anything to your car, so you can add more power, remove weight and do various other things to improve handling, such as suspension, brakes and tyres. You can also apply some preset decals to your car as well, but it is way too overpriced. No other game allowed you to go into so much detail when it came to changing the way that your car drives. Having Gran Turismo being a pioneer with this feature, I can imagine they probably had a few licensing issues with car manufacturers regarding the upgrades, which might be another reason why most of the car manufacturers that are in the game were based in Japan, as Japanese car manufacturers embraced tuning culture in real life. It's not like today where some manufacturers refuse to have their cars in a game at all if the player can repaint it to a certain shade of pink. Gran Turismo is coming up to 24 years old this year, and to be honest, it does feel like a 24-year-old game. It does have quite a few issues, but even with all of the technical difficulties, I think Polyphony Digital managed to make a brilliant game, and I think it is the only one in the series that is finished, as the other games have stuff either incomplete or missing. I just wish that they had put more manufacturers from outside of Japan into the game, but everything else is brilliant for an original PlayStation game. In May 1998, Sony awarded Gran Turismo a double platinum prize for sales above 2 million units in Japan alone. Not only that, but it also got a score of 96 out of 100 on Metacritic, constantly got 5-star reviews, and very high scores. Sony Computer Entertainment knew that they had a franchise which would make them a lot of money, and so they told Polyphony Digital to start work on a second game. It isn't known when development on Gran Turismo 2 started, but as it is more than 3 times the size of Gran Turismo 1, I'm going to take a well thought out guess and say that development started in the first half of 1998, when the developers and publishers saw the amazing sales figures of the first game. Development kinda started before that, as a lot of the assets and sounds came straight from the first game. What do you do when you have a best-selling, highly rated game? You just add more content, and that is exactly what Polyphony Digital did. And a lot of people think of Gran Turismo 2 as an expansion to the first game. Gran Turismo 2 was released on the PlayStation in December 1999 in Japan and North America, and January 2000 in Europe. Just like the first game, you start off with 10,000 credits, which again isn't a lot of money, but it is enough to get you a sort of powerful car that can be used to win some of the starter races that don't require a lot of power or even a license. Also, just like the first game, I started with a Mark III Toyota Supra, but the twin turbo, so it had 276 brake horsepower. So it was nowhere near the best car in the game, by far, but it was cheap, so it was good enough for what I wanted it for, and a little bit more. Eventually you will need to get the licenses to complete the game. There are 6 licenses this time. They are the National B, National A, International C, International B, International A, and the Super license. The license tests consist of driving maneuvers such as stopping in a box, driving around corners, and doing time trials. Just like the first game, you get either gold, silver, or bronze depending on how well you did the tests, and the time that you get at the end of the tests doesn't have an effect on you getting the license, just as long as you pass. The tests are fun to begin with, but they do get a bit boring and repetitive after the B license. The tests are also way too easy. With the DualShock, it is very easy to pass every test first time, but that wasn't possible with the PlayStation Classics controller. I've been looking through the footage of the Gran Turismo 1 and 2 gameplay, and I think the graphics in Gran Turismo 2 is a massive downgrade from the first game. Gran Turismo 2's car models don't seem to have as much detail as the models in the first game. It could just be the reflection and shine effect on the cars that's making them look like there's less detail, but it just doesn't look as good. The shine effect could have been added to mask the fact that cars have less detail, which would make sense, as the developers probably had to downgrade a few things to get the game to work on the PlayStation, as Gran Turismo 2 somehow used more of the PlayStation's power than the first game did. The physics do seem to be better though, which is probably where that extra power is going to. Cars are more controllable, especially the ones with more power. I'm not sure if Gran Turismo 2 uses a different physics engine, but it really does feel and look like it, and that makes the racing a lot more fun. Now, I say that, but you do need to have the right car for it to be fun. I don't really see the point of having a car with less than 200 brake horsepower, as there's a lot of rubber banding going on in the races. The rubber banding is so bad that in some cases you will need like 5 times the power of the opponents just to get a sizable lead on them. Gran Turismo has also got a lot of races that require you to either upgrade your car or buy a new one. This is mainly because of the manufacturer events. Rally events were also added to the game, and that just adds a whole nother layer to the gameplay, as every other racing game that was out at the time were either about rally or track racing, but never both. Gran Turismo has 27 tracks, which is almost 3 times more than the first game. A lot of them have been carried over from the first game, but about 60% of them were completely new. So not only have you got the brilliant tracks from the 1997 game, such as the High Speed Ring and Grand Valley Speedway, you've also got Midfield Raceway and Red Rock Valley Speedway as well. Polyphony Digital also made tracks based on real locations, like Rome and Seattle, but there is only one real racetrack, which is Laguna Seca. For the first time in the series, there are dirt tracks for the rally racers. Some of the dirt tracks are fictional, but Polyphony Digital did add Pikes Peak, which is a lot of fun. The tracks all look brilliant for a PlayStation 1 game, and the original tracks are laid out nicely. there are also a lot more cars in Gran Turismo 2 as well. Overall, there are nearly 650 cars from 36 manufacturers. Now I say there's nearly 650 cars, but Gran Turismo 2 has got the same problem that the first game had, where a lot of them were just the same model with different trim or different engines. The director of Polyphony Digital, Kazunori Yamauchi, made the first game with Japan in mind, and so almost all of the cars in the game were Japanese. But as Gran Turismo was a bestseller everywhere, Polyphony Digital had to include manufacturers from all around the world. The car manufacturers are split up into cities. The North City has manufacturers from Germany and the UK, the West City has manufacturers from France and Italy, the East City has cars from Japan, and the South City is all US manufacturers. What I like about the Gran Turismo series is that it's not all about supercars like other racing games that were out at the time, such as Need for Speed. There are so many different types of cars in the game, and that's one of the things that makes it so good. You have tiny K cars, such as the Daihatsu Midget and the Daihatsu Mira, to supercars like the Vector M12 and the Jaguar XJ220, with everything else in between. There were also a lot more race cars than there were in the first game. Most manufacturers have at least one race car in the dealership, but it's common to find 2 or more made by the more popular manufacturers. There's even a Renault Espace F1, which is basically an F1 car with an MPV body just bolted onto it. Just the idea of it is mental. If you're a fan of cars from the 1980s and 90s, then Gran Turismo 2 is definitely the game for you. One of the things that I don't like about the car list is the fact that there are a lot of notable manufacturers missing, but were originally supposed to appear in the game. Manufacturers such as Ferrari, Lamborghini, Pagani, McLaren and Porsche were all planned to appear in the game, but didn't due to licensing issues. It's not so much of an issue with Porsche, as you could just drive cars made by Roof, who were a Porsche tuner. Pagani would later appear in Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec 2 years later. McLaren didn't appear in the series until Gran Turismo 4 under BMW, but the interior of the F1 is shown on the cover of Gran Turismo 2. Ferrari didn't appear in the series until Gran Turismo HD in 2006, and Lamborghini was introduced in Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec. There were a lot of cars that were supposed to appear in the game, but I won't talk about them all as that would make this video over an hour long. Another thing that Polyphony Digital perfected was the tunability of cars in the game. The tuning options in Gran Turismo 2 are the same as they were in the first game, so you can do pretty much anything to your car, such as engine upgrades, weight reduction, tyre upgrades, and race modifications. So you can make a road car look like its race version, which might have been cut due to licensing. Overall, the racing is fun, doesn't get boring, and I like the fact that Polyphony Digital added rally events. The car list could have been better, and it would have been nice if Polyphony Digital got the licenses for all of the cars that they tried to put into the game. The one thing that I really don't like about the game is that there's a car limit of 100 in the garage, but Polyphony Digital did a brilliant job with the little time that they were given to develop the game. Looking back at Gran Turismo 1 and 2 now in 2021, I can see that they both haven't aged very well. But Polyphony Digital started something that other developers have been trying to replicate for years. Most notably Turn 10 Studios with Forza Motorsport on the original Xbox, which is now 16 years old, coming up to its 8th game, and has an open world spin-off, which has also contributed a lot to not just the racing genre, but video games in general. Like I said at the beginning of the review, I think most of what you see in racing games today can be traced back to the first 2 Gran Turismos on the original PlayStation in some way. In fact, it's all thanks to a Mario Kart ripoff, which was the basis of Gran Turismo. Gran Turismo 1 and 2 also influenced people's taste in cars. A lot of people like certain cars because they were featured in Gran Turismo, which was probably the first time they ever saw them. Gran Turismo 1 had a lot of cars that people in the West had never seen before, and then Gran Turismo 2 did the same thing for American people with European cars. I would say vice versa, but I'm pretty sure I would have been better off not knowing about the Dodge Neon. That isn't as common these days as more people have access to the internet, and with YouTube's algorithm as it is, you just stumble across videos about cars that you've never heard of before, which for me is usually something Russian. Personally, if it wasn't for Gran Turismo 1 and 2, then I probably wouldn't like cars as much as I do now. There are so many cars that these two games introduced me to, such as the Nissan Pulsar GTIR, Mitsubishi GTO, and the Jaguar XJR. Gran Turismo 2 has got a lot of bugs and issues, but just like the title to its intro song, it is my favourite game. This has been my review of Gran Turismo 1 and 2 on the original PlayStation, and I'm going to do the rest of the PlayStation 1 reviews like this in the future, as I don't want to oversaturate the channel with re-reviews and videos that are only 5 minutes long. I will also be doing these reviews once every 2 weeks until the end of the year, as they are taking longer and longer to make, and I'm running out of space on my hard drive, which has all of the review footage. If you liked this review, then please give it a like. If you didn't, then give it a dislike, and if you want to see more, then please consider subscribing and joining the Discord server linked in the description. Goodbye.